Alright, hello, welcome back, and today we're going to start lecture 47. This one's a big one, the Civil Rights Movement, or the height of the Civil Rights Movement. And by the height of the Civil Rights Movement, what I'm really talking is about the time from about World War II until 1968. This is the time that I'm designating. Of course, you can look at the Civil Rights Movement from a somewhat different point of view and a different perspective and see things a little bit differently, and I welcome you too. By the 47th lecture, you are more than capable, and especially those students who have been in my class and have done the essays and the thinking, all of you are, at this point, are more than capable of taking a look at the history by yourself without me, and doing this on your own. But that being said, I'm still going to continue with the lectures, so you don't get out of it that easily. So this is lecture 47, and rumors that I'm planning a 100-minute lecture are not entirely true, at least not yet. Now, who knows what this lecture is going to look like, because this is a pretty big issue. So we're going to jump right into it. So what we're going to do today, we're going to analyze the factors contributing to the expansion of the Civil Rights Movement. And we're going to start with, well, what were those influences? What was going on? I mean, we've been talking about civil rights pretty much all year. And when we started off talking about slavery and Bartolome de las Casas, we talked about Reconstruction, the abolitionist movement. We've been talking about civil rights pretty much this whole lecture series in some way, shape, or form. So why is it all of a sudden that we have this golden, what we might call a golden age of the civil rights movement? What was different in the 1950s and 60s that didn't exist before World War II? And there's a couple of things. So, first of all, of course, World War II was a shaping experience for a couple of reasons. And I also like to emphasize the Harlem Renaissance. And the experiences of African Americans as a cultural force after World War I. And that's kind of what I mean by the Harlem Renaissance. So the big difference here is by the 1950s, we had an African American experience in World War II, and we also had this Harlem Renaissance experience. And I'm going to explain just exactly what I mean by this and exactly how these events and these moments shaped what is going to become the Civil Rights Movement. And we're going to start off with just expanded experience overall, not just among African Americans, but also among white Americans. So, for one thing, we do have, during this period of World War, well, from about World War I until about World War II, we're going to experience what we could call the Great Migration. This Great Migration was a time period in which large numbers of African Americans were leaving the South and moving to the North. So this happened, of course, before World War I. We're also going to see a lot of movement taking place in and around World War II. And so consequently, what we're seeing is large numbers of African Americans coming in from different areas, not just of the country, but also of the world, and congregating in urban regions, and in urban regions where there's a lot more multiculturalism, and there's a lot more experiences to be gained, and a lot more stories to be told. And we're going to actually increase the amount of experience that's going to take place between white people and black people. For instance, with regard to the Harlem Renaissance, we see a black cultural movement that's taking place in the United States, and it's white people who are going to participate in this black cultural movement. It's white people who are going to places like the Cotton Club and to jazz clubs and things along those lines, and buying the albums by Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, and other folks who are out there, and they're becoming accustomed to being around African Americans. In a way that they had never been around them before. Count Basie, and there's a lot of cultural influences that are really going to shape and kind of start to reshape white attitudes with regard to African Americans and their status in society. We also see that, especially with regard to World War II, I mean, there's a huge contradiction here. On one hand, we sent our soldiers off to fight what was, in essence, the ultimate racist, right? Fascism and Nazi fascism and Adolf Hitler. So we're going off to fight these ultimate racists, and what do we see is, well, we're doing it with a segregated military. The United States military was still segregated, black units and white units. Some of these black units, like the Tuskegee Airmen shown here, fought valiantly for the cause and for American freedom and that kind of thing. So there's a tremendous amount of hypocrisy going on when we take a look at our military, and also the exploits of African American soldiers in World War II became fairly well known, as were the exploits of African American soldiers in World War I. So we also saw that during World War II, especially, tremendous gains on the part of African Americans. So we had we had A. Philip Randolph working and pushing Franklin Roosevelt to create equal employment in companies that were getting federal funds to fight the war. We saw that Franklin Roosevelt had established a black caucus. We see a black diplomat, Ralph Bunche, winning the Nobel Peace Prize. So there are some significant gains that are going to take place, especially as a result of World War II. And finally, under this, we're going to see a greater I think we talked about this greater interaction with white folks. I think, well, we covered it. All right, so we're good. So we got your four there. So we have the Great Migration, which is going to increase experience. We have greater interaction among white people. We have the hypocrisy of a segregated military, and we see that there are established political gains here. Jackie Robinson is another perfectly good example where we actually see African Americans now moving into baseball and being great. We can't rule out, we can't diminish the importance of that in American culture, where sports was a big honking deal. Pardon me, you didn't hear that. So we also see, as a result of World War II, there was a tremendous demand for labor, which of course meant that people were making wages. People overseas in the military were also making wages. So for the first time, really in American history, African Americans, we start to see the expansion of a middle-class African American population. And we also see that working-class African Americans are going to be doing better financially. Which means greater money and more leisure time, more free time. And what are African Americans oftentimes going to do with this greater wealth and with this greater leisure time is they're going to put their money and their time into organizing groups like established groups like the NAACP, which we've talked about before, and a relatively new group called the Congress of Racial Equity. The CORE is going to be a major influence that's going to happen. As far as organizing protests and organizing social movements to confront unjust laws. We also see the age-old organization taking place in African American churches, especially African American churches coming out of the South that are organizing to kind of take care of African Americans who are living in a formally segregated society. And as a result of the New Deal and the minor pathways that had been opened up for African Americans under the New Deal, we see a larger number of African Americans are starting to join the Democratic Party. They're leaving the Republican Party and they're joining the Democratic Party, which is a bit awkward considering that Southern Democrats are still very segregationist and dedicated to Jim Crow, but it also provides opportunity for Northern Democrats, Northern liberal Democrats especially, to emphasize the growing power of African Americans within the Democratic Party and accommodating that power in the Democratic Party. So organization becomes very important. Also, the United States was involved in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, and this is going to have an impact on the civil rights movement, believe it or not. It's true, I wouldn't lie to you. And the nature of this is that it was very difficult for the United States to expand into places like, Africa, and still have these very harsh measures by which African Americans are being treated in the United States. It was very difficult to justify why African countries should do business with the United States when Africans in the United States are being treated so badly. And you gotta think that the Soviet negotiators, who were also trying to expand their influence into African countries, were not going to hesitate in pointing that out. Do you want to be treated like African Americans in the American South? And of course they didn't. And this was really becoming a huge point of contention. The Soviet Union was using American segregation and American Jim Crow as propaganda against American expansion. And, well, that's a real problem. And finally, we can't underestimate this brand new technology that came out in the late 1940s, early 1950s, called television. And by the end of the 1950s, just about everybody's got a television, and they can watch TV. So when they see protests taking place, these protests are actually being beamed into your living room all the time. So you actually get to see these great speeches, these great protests, and oftentimes the very violent counteraction to these protests, which make those people who want to maintain the status quo look really bad. Television is going to have a huge influence over the civil rights movement. So consequently, what we see is the development of a very powerful and very outspoken civil rights movement that becomes a force in everyday life, not just African American life, as was the case before World War II, but in everyday life for all Americans. Well, let's take a closer look. Let's see some of this stuff. So this stuff is going to come at you relatively quickly here, but of course we're going to have to start off with Harry S. Truman, because Harry S. Truman was not a particularly equitable fellow. He was a pretty racist guy, but he was also a very shrewd politician, and he sees the growing influence of African American politicians in the Democratic Party. And he's also facing the prospects of not winning the 1948 presidential election. He knows this. He's not a particularly popular president. So if he can change some things to get a few more votes for himself, it might just put him over the top, and he'll win this 1948 election. So what is he going to do? Well, a number of the things that he's going to do. First, one of probably the quickest and easiest thing that he could do is, as Commander-in-Chief of the United States Armed Forces, he could simply give the order to desegregate the military, and that's exactly what he did. He orders the desegregation of the United States military. So from now on, we're no longer going to have white units and black units. We're going to have a mix of units, and black soldiers and white soldiers are going to have to fight, learn how to work together toward this end. Now, of course, this is going to become even more important with the Korean War. The Korean War, it will be the very first war in American history in which black soldiers and white soldiers are going to fight side by side. And when soldiers fight side by side, they establish a certain camaraderie that is also going to be a motivating factor for the civil rights movement down the road. He's also going to establish a commission for studying civil rights and for coming up with solutions for civil rights issues. This commission will put out a report, and unfortunately, Harry Truman, when he gets this report, he's not going to offer an awful lot of legislation based on this report. And what legislation he does do is that he does put forth is largely going to be filibustered in Congress and isn't going to get anywhere. So this doesn't really happen very much. And finally, in the presidential platform, or the Democratic National Platform in 1948, for the very first time, we're actually going to see a civil rights-based platform, the idea of political equity for African Americans in the Democratic Party. Of course, this was we could say, cynical effort to get African Americans to join the Democratic Party and to leave the Republican Party for purely electoral reasons. And the reality is, cynical or not, it worked. More numbers of African Americans started to join the Democratic Party. So by 1948, about 70% of African Americans were voting Democratic. At least those who could vote were voting Democratic. And what do you know? This actually gives Harry Truman just enough votes to get over the top and defeat Thomas Dewey. And as we saw in the last lecture, that was a squeaker. And it was largely because of the African American vote. Now, this is a lesson to Democrats. If you want to win elections, you're going to have to attract the African American vote to your party. And that's exactly what Truman does. Now, we're moving on. Now, this is a watershed moment happens in the 1950s with a couple of influences going on here. These influences are Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, and the Montgomery bus boycott. Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas was a Supreme Court case that was tried by this fellow here, Thurgood Marshall. in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. And Thurgood Marshall, of course, when he entered into this scheme, he came up with into this case, he had an opportunity to simply say, hey, look, what was going on was African Americans did not have equal access to education resources, to schools. And now he could have argued this on Plessy versus Ferguson grounds. Plessy versus Ferguson declared that separate was okay so long as it was equal, but in the South especially, it was clearly not equal. So the African American schools were run down, nasty, tore up schools with the least qualified teachers and the worst resources and the oldest books, etc., etc. It was clearly just not equal. So he could have made a Plessy case, but he decided not to. Instead, he decided to fight and argue before the United States Supreme Court that segregation, separate, keeping the races separate, was, by its very nature, not equal. That segregation itself was wrong. And you know what? He won. I wish I could just talk about the Brown case for just a little while, but I don't want to get into it. Maybe I'll do another lecture some other day. But he wins this case. He wins the case unanimously. And the Supreme Court strikes down Plessy versus Ferguson. Holy cow. The Supreme Court actually struck down an earlier ruling. That doesn't happen very often, but it did in Brown versus the Board of Education. The next thing that was happening in and around the same time was the Montgomery bus boycott. In the mid-1950s, 1954, 1955, this woman, of course, very famous woman, Rosa Parks, she gets on a bus and she decides that she's not going to give up her seat to a white passenger. Of course, the folklore behind Rosa Parks is that she was simply tired, and she gets on the bus and she just doesn't want to take it anymore, so she refuses to give up her seat and all hell breaks loose. Well, that wasn't exactly how it happened. In fact, she got on that bus knowing perfectly well that she was going to break this particular law, that she was going to not give up her seat. It had nothing. She was tired, but she wasn't just tired from a long day of work. She was actually just tired of segregation, and it worked. She was, of course, arrested. This is her mugshot. For not giving up her seat, and this is going to start a series of protests and a boycott. A boycott is when people refuse to do business with a certain entity. They refuse to spend their money. In this case, it was African Americans, especially African American women, who were refusing to ride on public transportation buses. Well, this is a real problem because this is costing the city money. The city of Montgomery is losing money as a result of this. And ultimately, with the leadership of a new guy by the name of Martin Luther King, we actually see African Americans in Montgomery win this particular battle, and public transportation in Montgomery, Alabama was desegregated. So you have two huge victories. And what was the result of these victories? Well, it was kind of a five-fold result of these victories. First, desegregation is now shown nationally to be delegitimized. Okay, we have seen that it clearly has been delegitimized by the Supreme Court, and it was delegitimized by the Montgomery bus boycott, when Montgomery, Alabama just desegregated. So it puts a chink in the armor of the old Jim Crow laws. It also provided a legal framework by which other activists and other groups could challenge segregation. It provides an example to other communities as to what can be done and how we can organize and how we can fight, and how we can fight in such a way that we become sympathetic. And that has to do a lot with the leadership of Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King had a method of fighting that was inspired by Henry David Thoreau and Mahatma Gandhi, non-violent resistance. Rosa Parks wasn't throwing stones and wasn't fighting aggressively. She was simply sitting on a bus, which under any other circumstances would not be considered a problem. So then why would it be considered a problem simply because she is black and she's sitting on a bus? And it forces us, nonviolent resistance forces us to confront these contradictions. All she's doing is sitting on the bus and she gets arrested, right? And she's willing to be arrested. She willingly gets arrested for this. Well, why would somebody willingly be arrested? Maybe we need to take a look at this law and put it under a little bit more scrutiny. And then finally, in this, it results in a legal framework. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 is going to be passed through Congress, and the Civil Rights Act of 1957 is going to create a civil rights division in the Department of Justice by which to take a look at civil rights issues, which means you now have a government body in which to send your civil rights complaints, your segregation complaints, and those segregation complaints will be investigated. So this is kind of huge. Now, it does result in a backlash. So among many southern states especially, we see something written up called the Southern Manifesto, in which a number of governors in southern states are going to sign on and say they are going to resist with everything they have any efforts to desegregate and force their good white people to associate with black people in the South. And this is going to play out in a little place called Little Rock, Arkansas, in which the governor of Little Rock, a fellow by the name of Orville Faubus, is going to stand in the way, and he's going to say, hey, look, we have these little black school children who want to go to a white school here in Little Rock. I'm not going to let them do it. I'm going to stand in their way, and I'm going to put soldiers in their way because, 9-year-old little elementary school kids are really, really dangerous, right? They're really, really threatening. Well, they were, as far as Faubus was concerned. And he literally has soldiers blocking and white parents who are upset about the prospect of black kids going to their children's school are there yelling and screaming, throwing rocks and throwing fruit in the whole 9 yards. Eventually, President Eisenhower, to his credit, is going to simply say, hey, look, I want to resolve this problem. I'm simply going to federalize the state National Guard, and we're going to escort these kids to school, which he did. And those soldiers are going to escort those kids to school for about a year and make sure that they're taken care of and make sure that they're safe. So, that was to Eisenhower's credit. Unfortunately, he never does actually, President Eisenhower never does embrace the idea of desegregation. He simply said that, hey, look, this is the law. The Supreme Court has ruled that schools need to be desegregated with all deliberate speed, so I'm going to fulfill my executive function in enforcing the law. This is kind of his way of not actually having to support the civil rights movement while at the same time supporting the civil rights movement. We're going to see this balancing act quite a lot. Now, one of the things, of course, that we do see happening is the rise of this fellow here. Of course, we all know Martin Luther King, and he is going to demonstrate that there are some benefits. This here is a quote from Martin Luther King about the lessons that were learned as a result of the Montgomery bus boycott. And I'm not going to read it because, again, I don't want this to go to 100 minutes and then all the rumors will be true, which will be very, very embarrassing. But he's kind of giving us an idea of what we've learned. And what he's learned is that nonviolent resistance is an effective way of dealing with what is otherwise a violent scheme. All right. So moving on, we are going to see some increased organization. So Martin Luther King himself is going to help to organize the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, dedicated to nonviolence and to peaceful resistance. We also see the forming of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee with the help of activist Ella Baker. And the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is also going to be dedicated to nonviolence, but is going to be a lot more assertive. They're talking about, actually moving into buildings and refusing to leave and things along those lines, becoming a little bit more in your face with regard to how they want to address civil rights issues. We see this with the Woolworths sit-in movement in 1960. A group of college students organized by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee are going to simply walk into a Woolworths lunch counter, and they're going to sit down, and they're going to, wait to be waited on. Now, Woolworths, African Americans could buy products in Woolworths, but they were not allowed to buy lunch at the lunch counter. So these four young men kind of went in. Of course, they did not get served and waited on. They were, at the end of the day, they were asked to leave, and they came back the next day with some more people, and then more students. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was, at least at first, a multiracial organization. So now we have white students who are coming in and sitting in with the black students. Pretty soon, Woolworths all over the state, all over the country, were being filled up with African Americans who were sitting at the lunch counter, not getting served, not making money. So if I refuse to serve you, well, what am I going to do? Well, we got to get you to try to leave. So there was some fights that broke out. Customers would come in, dump stuff on the Woolworth. So I mean, we can kind of take a look at this image here. This is a image from the Woolworth sit-in, and take a look. I mean, we can kind of see just how much pressure there is on these young people. They're having stuff dumped all over them. People are laughing at them. You know, this young. We'll just. But take a look at this young lady here. Of course, she thinks this is great fun. You know, this fella here, he's kind of a jerk about it. So there's quite a few people who are having a lot of fun with this making fools out of these activists. But why are they sitting there? One of the things that many of my students suggest is, how do you sit there and just take this kind of abuse? Well, I like to look at the people in the crowd. Take a look at some of the people in the crowd. I'll point some out to you. So take a look at this gentleman over here. Right? Take a look at his face. Let's take a look at some of these other people here. Take a look at this guy next to the girl who seems to be having a good time. Especially take a look at this fellow here in the background, right? Let's see here if I can kind of make this. I guess I can't make it small. But take a look at him in the background, right? Take a look at this fellow here. Now, let's take a closer look at some of these folks. You know, this does not look like a guy who's having a good time, does it? This fellow here. This fellow here is having some doubts, and that's why you don't fight. That's why you don't start throwing punches, because you're communicating to these guys. You know, you're communicating to these fellas here, right? These are the ones you want to talk to. You're not going to talk to this guy, right? You're not going to talk to him. You're not going to change him. You're not going to change this joker here. But these are the people that you're talking to. And in talking to them, you're increasing the movement. You're at least you're especially making your movement sympathetic. The minute you throw that first punch, however, you lose sympathy. Of course, the newspapers will talk about how violent there's this violent protest at Woolworths, and we should lock all these people up. I've seen it happen plenty of times, where any violence that's associated with these protests becomes attributed to the protests themselves and ends up discrediting those protests. And it's really not. It's counterproductive. No, being nonviolent means changing minds, and that's the goal of these movements. So we see some more. We see the Freedom Rides in 1961. This was challenging segregation on public transportation. Freedom Rides were put together, and these were multiracial buses. Greyhound buses that were rented, filled with black and white people, and going across state lines into places like Alabama and Mississippi, where in at least one case, well, multiple cases actually, but especially in this particular case, the bus was stopped on the road, the windows were broken, and a bomb was thrown inside the bus. When people came out of the bus, they were beaten very, very badly, and tried to turn these buses around. So we have the Freedom Rides. We have Birmingham in 1963, in which Martin Luther King leads a protest movement in Birmingham. For desegregation, to desegregate the stores and places there. People were beaten. The sheriff in that area, a fellow by the name of Bull Connor, decides to put down these protesters. They're beaten up. They're hit with sticks. They have fire hoses turned on them. Martin Luther King himself is thrown into jail, where he writes his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. And this just remember, this is playing out on television. People are watching this, going, "Holy, what?" The whole world is going crazy here. And then ultimately, we see the March on Washington, D.C. in 1963. First, President Kennedy is going to try to, hey, you know, we don't do this march. But eventually, President Kennedy says, all right, well, come along, march and do your protest. And it was huge. Over 250,000 people showed up in the mall in Washington, D.C. to listen to Joan Baez and speeches given by people like John Lewis, our current representative. And also, of course, Martin Luther King is going to cap it all off with his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. So this March on Washington, and again, playing on television, huge throngs of people showing up, holding hands, singing "We Shall Overcome." And this is really, really positive, powerful and positive imagery that was going on. And President Kennedy at this time is going to be affected by this. Now, when we think about the Civil Rights Movement, we definitely think about President John F. Kennedy. The truth is that historically, President Kennedy was a latecomer to this idea of the Civil Rights Movement. Now, his brother Bobby Kennedy was in charge of was the Attorney General. He was in charge of this 1957 Civil Rights Act, Department of Justice civil rights, and he did kind of look into some of these civil rights cases, but really, really slow. And it took a tremendous amount of energy on the part of activists to get the attention of the Kennedys with regard to civil rights. But ultimately, Birmingham is going to do it. The beating that these folks took at Birmingham is going to do it. I mean, take a look. This guy's being attacked by a police dog. This is pretty serious stuff here. This is a 17-year-old kid. So this imagery is going to have an impact, if nothing else. So ultimately, John F. Kennedy is going to be influenced by these moments, and he is going to request. He's going to make a statement on national television. We face a moral crisis as a country and a people. It cannot be met by repressive police action. It cannot be left to increase demonstrations in the streets. It cannot be quieted by token moves or talk. It is a time to act in Congress, in your state and local legislative body, and above all, in all our daily lives. It looks like President Kennedy has seen the light. However, it is too little too late for the Kennedy administration at this stage of the game. He does offer some civil rights legislation, but only a couple months later, a couple months after the March on Washington, we're going to see the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, and his administration will come to an end. It is left to Lyndon Baines Johnson to act on civil rights. That's not a good sign, right? This was really depressing to civil rights activists during this time. Lyndon Johnson does not have a good civil rights record. He's a Southern Texas Democrat. He's spent a tremendous amount of his time in the legislature blocking civil rights legislation. So there was no indication that Lyndon Johnson was going to be successful in this, or even interested in this civil rights agenda. But the movement was so strong. There was so much activity in the streets that Lyndon Johnson, as a president and as a politician, simply can't ignore the stuff that's going on around him. And in fact, we're actually going to see the civil rights stuff that we did not actually see from Kennedy is going to be implemented by Lyndon Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson will go down as the most significant civil rights president in American history. Ultimately, he will get the Civil Rights Act of 1965 passed through Congress. And he gets it passed through Congress with very few changes and very few compromises. At one point, of course, he calls his best friend Richard Russell, who was filibustering the Civil Rights Act, and he says, "Hey, look, you're my best friend, and I love you, but if you stand in my way on the Civil Rights Act, I'm going to run you over." And Richard Russell says, "You might just do that, but if you do it, the Democrats will lose the South forever." And Lyndon Johnson, in a rare moment of courage, says, "If that is the price that I have to pay, I will gladly pay it." He does, in fact, get his civil rights legislation in. The Civil Rights Act is going to include, it's going to prohibit discrimination in any business now. And of course, it's one thing to deal with, like the Brown decision dealt with segregation in public utilities, right? This is stuff that taxpayers pay for, white taxpayers, black taxpayers. So yeah, desegregation. But what about a business? How about telling a business owner, "Hey, look, if you own a restaurant, you have to do business with black people, even if you don't like black people. You can't discriminate based on their race and their sex and their gender and whatever. You can't do it." Imagine telling a private business owner that he has to do business with somebody whom he does not like. And the rationale is, of course, hey, look, guess what? Maybe taxpayers aren't paying for your business, but your business is located on a road that is paid for by taxpayers, white taxpayers and black taxpayers. It is, you know, the city is maintained by white and black taxpayers. You have electricity that is subsidized by white and black taxpayers. If you have a public utility, if you're providing a public function, you can't discriminate. The Civil Rights Act. Also, it's going to outlaw, you know, discrimination in federal agencies and federal hiring. It is going to create an equal employment opportunity commission to make sure that that people are not being discriminated against in the workplace. Hey, look, if somebody who is qualified applies for a job at your store, doesn't matter if you like them or not. If they're qualified, you got to hire them. And it will also provide legal and financial help to further desegregation. So this was a huge, huge piece of legislation that's going to be signed by Lyndon Johnson. Also under Lyndon Johnson, we'll see the addition of the 24th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The 24th Amendment will make it unlawful to charge poll taxes when people go to vote for national office. So basically, it eliminates poll taxes. I mean, usually even state elected officials are on the same ballots as national officials. So you can't deny them through poll taxes, which was used very often to stop poor people, especially poor black people, from voting, especially in southern states. So we end up with the 24th Amendment. Uh-oh, hold on. Oh, there we go. Oh, come on. This is why stuff lasts so long. It has nothing to do with me being long-winded. It's because the kid... I'm sorry. All right, so now we're going to build on this victory. Of course, we see this huge victory in 1964. There's more work to be done. So we see, for instance, Freedom Summer. The goal of Freedom Summer is to crack open the last real bastion, the last citadel of segregation, Mississippi. Of course, Mississippi, huge levels of poverty, huge levels of segregation, very large black population. Almost 95% of African American eligible voters in Mississippi are not able to vote. They're not registered to vote. This is a huge, huge problem. So we're going to send folks down into Mississippi to register people to vote. Some of these guys, Michael Schwimmer, John Cheney, but these are activists who go down into Mississippi to register black people to vote. They end up getting murdered and dumped into a river, investigated by the FBI going down there, creating huge problems. It was referred to as the Long Hot Summer. We also see the formation of freedom schools. These were schools that were established to educate African Americans, young African Americans, teach them not just reading, language arts outside of the school system, but also American history and civics and civic responsibility. These were very powerful movement. We also see, founded by a woman by the name of, a sharecropper by the name of Mary Lou Hamer, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And what she's going to try to do is she's actually going to try to get a black delegate at the to show up at the Democratic National Convention from Mississippi. And Lyndon Johnson's going to draw the line there. He's going to say, hey, no, we don't want that. I'm going to have enough problems with trying to get southern states to vote for me as it is. I can't have a black delegate in the National Commission. And the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party says, oh yeah, you're going to have it. Finally, they said, all right, well, we'll give you 2 seats. And Mary Lou Hamer and her organization here says 2 seats isn't going to do it, and she walks out. She walks out and scolds the Democratic Party in this case. We also see the March on Selma, organization on Selma with Martin Luther King and other organizers organizing protests in Selma, Alabama. And ultimately, the goal here, of course, is to desegregate that particular city. And this is going to have a huge impact on the 1960. What's going on here? And so we're looking at the 1964 election during this time, and I'm all mixed up here. So the goal here is desegregate the city, and ultimately what they decide to do is they're going to march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, and create kind of a huge march. Well, while the marchers were marching, of course, this was about 50 years almost to the day of this particular lecture. While these marchers are marching, they get to the Edmund Pettus Bridge over Selma, where they are met by the local police. On horseback and on foot, and as they try to cross the bridge, all they're trying to do is cross the bridge, the police attack them. Again, John Lewis, one of the organizers and a current representative in Congress, had his skull cracked. It was a bloody mess. It was referred to as Bloody Sunday. But regardless, this movement is going to have a very... by the way, they ultimately do manage the march to Montgomery. Martin Luther King comes up with a compromise, and it really gets the people at the SNCC angry because they felt he compromised too much, and ultimately the protest will get itself to Montgomery. And these events will have an impact on the 1964 election. The 1964 election is going to show a large percentage, 95%, of African Americans are going to turn out to vote for Lyndon Johnson in 1964, and Lyndon Johnson's going to win by an absolute landslide. And ultimately, this is going to also result, the beating that they took in Selma and the huge advantage that Lyndon Johnson ended up with in 1964 is going to lead to the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act is going to provide federal supervision of certain states and actually certain counties. Many counties in the north, as a matter of fact, also fell under the Voting Rights Act because of the low numbers of African American voters, a low percentage of African American population, eligible voters that were actually registered. So this put these counties under federal supervision until it could be demonstrated that federal supervision was no longer necessary. This provision of the Voting Rights Act, by the way, is actually going to be overturned by the Supreme Court as of a couple of years ago, about a year ago, and it also is going to outlaw the use of literacy tests as a means of blocking people from voting. So the Voting Rights Act, huge, among other things. So here we go again. Okay, hold on. Do it the old-fashioned way. All right. Now, we also start to see, during this time, we can't just talk about Martin Luther King and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. There were other voices that were taking place, especially as the 1960s wear on. And most significantly, we'll talk about the Black Power movement. There were other movements and other ideas out there as well. But the goal of the Black Power movement is they're kind of inheriting their ideas from the Black nationalist movement of Marcus Garvey in the 1920s that we talked about in an earlier lecture. Goals of this is, one, we want to have self-determination among black communities. We want to have self-sufficiency. We don't want black communities to be dependent upon white money and white graciousness and letting us vote and all this other kind of garbage, right? We want to actually just be able to do this for ourselves, and consequently what we're talking about is just completely separating from white America. We don't want to have any part of with white America at this stage of the game. Look what's going on. So the Black Power movement is also going to be dedicated to reestablishing African American culture and identity, especially the African part of African American, and this also includes the idea of taking a look at and rejecting our quote-unquote slave names, as was exemplified by Malcolm X, who was actually Malcolm Little, and he rejected his slave name, ultimately the name Little, and he protested by creating that X. His understanding was, hey, look, my real identity as an African male has been robbed from me by the legacy of slavery. So I'm going to reject the whole notion entirely. Many of these folks are actually going to go and take Muslim names. Malcolm X was a convert to Nation of Islam, as was Cassius Clay, whom we know as Muhammad Ali. We're going to see people changing their names entirely. So Malcolm X, of course, he has a very different understanding. He has a very different idea about civil rights and about nonviolence. Of course, he kind of has a certain amount of respect for nonviolence, but his question and the question of folks like Stokely Carmichael or Huey Newton is, well, why should we take a beating in order to express our rights? Why should we be beaten? No. We should be able to defend ourselves and defend our rights and defend our communities from violence. So, and if we have to do that in a violent way, we should be able to do that. This becomes known, this idea of self-reliance, self-determination, self-defense, and separation becomes part of this idea of the Black Power movement. Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton will publish their book called Black Power in 1967. And we're also going to see the rise of a group of folks called the Black Panther movement. And this was a militant movement that believed in armed self-defense of the black community. These folks even dressed in militarized uniforms. They provided cover and protection of black African Americans who were doing things like going to vote and protest and things along those lines. They would show up armed. And another thing that they provided is they would keep watch over police. They would provide surveillance of police and letting them know, hey, we're watching you. We're not going to let you beat our people. So this is going to become a huge problem. Now the Black Panthers also were involved in education, food drives, and things along those lines. But this is a serious militant threat against the established police, and consequently, the Black Panthers will be targeted for arrest, and their offices will be raided and things along those lines. So this is kind of another aspect of the civil rights movement, a very important aspect of the civil rights movement. These guys were hugely influential, and nobody really described quite the anger and anguish of African Americans during this time, like folks like Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael. Nobody was speaking about this stuff in quite the angry way that they were speaking. And we had to understand that anger. We had to understand that level of angst that was being experienced in order to truly promote the movement from this perspective. So a very, very powerful legacy of the civil rights movement. Ultimately, another legacy of the civil rights movement is going to be in the deaths. I mean, a lot of people died. A lot of people we have to understand that. A lot of people put their lives and their well-being on the line for the civil rights that today we mostly take for granted. Now, granted, we understand even now that there's work that needs to be done in civil rights. But we don't typically think about just not being able to go to a restaurant, not being able to vote, poll taxes and things like that. We don't really think about that all that much anymore. And that's because of the sacrifices that were made by people who literally put their lives and their physical well-being on the line peacefully and maybe not so peacefully. Folks like Medgar Evers, who was assassinated in 1963. John F. Kennedy, of course, assassinated, although not necessarily for civil rights reasons. Malcolm X was assassinated by agents of the Nation of Islam, which he eventually rejected. And he will be killed. But 1968, of course, I could do a whole lecture on just 1968. Maybe I will at some point. But Martin Luther King. We lose Martin Luther King Jr. To a racist. And ultimately we also lose Robert Kennedy, who was running for president at the time and had a strong civil rights platform in his presidency, despite the lacking civil rights record that he had as Attorney General. So these were real huge setbacks for the civil rights movement. Of course, it's not the end of the civil rights movement, but we're no longer going to see the same kind of impetus put into civil rights that we saw up to 1968. So I'm going to stop there. It didn't quite make it to 100 minutes, but maybe I'll try harder the next time. And talk to you later.